Hello, everyone. This is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, March the 9th, 2025. Interesting piece in the Times a couple of days ago, the New York Times, that is, about a so-called British flamethrower who is a comic best suited to taking on Trump. They're talking about a man called Kumar, Nish Kumar, who looks very funny and apparently is very angry too. I have to admit, I haven't seen him. It's an interesting subject. It suggests that at the moment, even in spite of Trump and outraging many Americans, the state of American humor could be amped up a bit. My guest today is a writer on the Stephen Colbert Show and a comic, or certainly a comic writer in his own right, Felipe Torres Medina. He has a new book out on Tuesday. It's called America, Let Me In. And I'm thrilled that he's joining us from Harlem in Manhattan today. Congratulations, Felipe, on the new job. What do you, of the new book? I was going to say job. That's a Freudian error here. What do you make of the Times' observation that American humor isn't in its best state when it comes to Trump?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. First of all, I love Nish Kumar. I think he's a wonderful, wonderful comedian. He's very funny. He has a level of wit, and his observations are just wonderful. I hadn't seen this article, but I really appreciate that the Times recognized him because he's been working very hard for a lot of years. I think more than American humor not being fit for the moment, I think, at least personally, for me, a little bit of addressing Trump again and addressing Trump in general is, jokes have to be new. And after basically 10 years of Donald Trump every day, all the time, it's certainly hard to continue to find new angles. Now, the dysfunction of the administration and perhaps sometimes the cruelty and whatever they're doing does provide you with material, but I think it can cause you or personally it causes me as a writer to be like, oh God, here we go again, more Trump stuff, because that's what we're talking about.
Do you see your book, Felipe, as a Trump book, America, Let Me In? It's about immigration. I mean, it obviously touches on, in many ways, on Trump and certainly his hostility to immigration and immigrants. But is it a Trump book, or is it a broader kind of critique or observation about contemporary America?
Yeah, I never set out to write a book about Trump or a Trump book. My goal was to write a book about the immigration system because I went through it, and as a comedian, I encountered in it many contradictions and absurdities that just kind of became fodder to me for comedy. So I try to write this book about the system, but the system was caused by many administrations in many parties. Now the current hostility or the current everythingness of immigration, immigration being kind of in the forefront of the national discourse, certainly has been aided by Republican policy in the past 10 years and by Donald Trump's rhetoric. But that doesn't mean that this is a book about Trump or as a response to Trump. It's actually a book responding to a system that is flawed and messy, but it's the one we have.
Yeah, you described the book as a love letter to immigrants, but it's not a love letter to the system. Tell me
No.
your story. As you say, you went through it, so you have firsthand experience. Where were you born?
So I was born in Colombia. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, which is the capital of Colombia. I lived there most of my life. I moved to the United States when I was 21 on a student visa because I came here to do my master's. I did my master's in screenwriting at Boston University. And after that, I started working here as a comedian, but also as a writer. And I was able to get an Alien of Extraordinary Ability visa, which is a very pretentiously named visa. It kind of makes you sound like you're in the X-Men, but it's just what they call talent visas for artists, athletes, entrepreneurs, educators, whatever. And so I got one of those and then several renewals of those. And then, thanks to my work as a writer, as a comedian, initially as a copywriter in advertising, I was able to, I met the love of my life, got married, and then I have a green card, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I'm quoting here, it sounds rather funny, an alien of extraordinary ability. Do you think your experience is typical? I mean, even the fact that you came for grad school to Boston puts you in a kind of intellectual or professional elite. So, is your experience in any way typical, do you think?
I wouldn't say typical. I would say my experience is the experience of many people who come here. And I think it's the experience of the people who are quote unquote the immigrants we want, right? And if we're going to dive into the rhetoric of of immigration these days, I came the right way and did everything quote unquote the right way, but what this book and also this journey that I took to immigrate here proves is that it's only possible with tremendous amount of privilege and tremendous amounts of money. It's a very expensive process for the majority of people.
How much did it cost you?
Oh, I think in total since I started, I mean, when you count the fact that for most like master's programs, you don't get any sort of financial aid unless you get like a scholarship from your own country or a sort of like Fulbright or something like that. There's already the cost of a full master's program.
Although you weren't coming, I mean, you didn't pay for your master's program in order to get immigration papers, did you?
No, of course not. But I had to pay for my master's program to be able to study here. I didn't have my any sort of aid. But discounting that in terms of immigration paperwork, I've spent tens of thousands of dollars because you have to hire immigration lawyers to make sure that everything is fine, and those are quite expensive.
Was it worth it?
Well, yeah, I met the love of my life. I live a very.
I mean, there are lots of loves of you. You could have met someone else.
That's true.
Airport, you might have even met her or him at an airport somewhere else while they were on vacation.
That's possible, but yeah, I mean, I live a good life. I do what I wanted to do. I got my master's because I wanted to write comedy professionally, and I get to do that. And I do think when I set out to do this, I was like, well, the place with the best film and television industry in the world is and was then and still is the United States. So I was like, well, I have to go there, and I was able to become a part of this industry and to work in this art form.
You
that
didn't
I
just
love.
get any job. You got the Colbert job.
Yes.
Felipe. You drew the short straw, right? I bet nobody else wants to write for Stephen Colbert.
Yeah, I'm very lucky, but again, it's a mix of luck and hard work and all those things. So, yeah, I don't regret moving to the United States.
So some people might be watching this. Maybe some MAGA people. I'm not sure if MAGA people really watch this. But if they were, they might be thinking, well, Felipe Torres Medina, he's a good example. He's the type of person we want. He jumped through many hoops. He's really smart. He's really successful. He brings value to this country. He's now a full-time writer on the Colbert Show. He came from Latin America. And he's exactly the kind of person we want. And we want a system that's hard because only guys like him have the intellectual and financial resources to actually get through it. How would you respond to them?
I would say that I appreciate the compliments, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the best way to move forward on immigration. Now, I will say this book is a humorous take on the whole immigration journey. And so I tell different stories of different people coming here, made up but inspired by real life. And so one of the paths that you can take in this book, because this is kind of an interactive choose your own path book, is mine. But I think what this book tries to prove is that even if you do everything right, even if you have the money sometimes, it's very, very hard. And that, I think, does put us at a disadvantage when it comes to having a workforce that could be productive for the country, especially as birth rates are declining. We are headed toward what people have described as a barrel economy if we don't simply up the population. And the people who are upping the population and actually having children are immigrants.
One other piece of news today, there's obviously a huge amount of news on the immigration front, is apparently there's a freeze on funding to help green card holders. You've been through the process. You write about it in the new book, but how much more difficult is it now?
You mean under the current administration?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know. I think
this idea of even freezing green card holders. So even if you have a green card, you get frozen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's I think that's what Trump did in his first term, more or less, with legal immigration, was to create roadblocks and freezes and these kinds of things to kind of just like stymie the process and make it slower, make it harder, even for people who, again, are doing everything right to be able to remain in the country.
And I'm guessing also some of the DOJ stuff about laying off immigration judges and court staff. They're taking offers to leave. Apparently 100 immigration court staff are retiring. This adds to it as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, is a very particular part of the government because it is one of the few parts of the federal government that it funds itself. Again, going back to cost, the fees that they make are so big, they make so much money that if there's a government shutdown, actually USCIS does not shut down. It's one of the few parts of the government that doesn't need to shut down because they make so much money out of the immigrants trying to come here. So it's a really, really strange part of the government. It kind of doesn't know where it belongs. So seeing like the DOJ cuts that arrive into that may be implemented into USCIS are I'm not familiar with any DOJ cuts recently on USCIS, but I suspect that they would be strange because it's a very strange division of the federal government. It's not like the Department of Education or the Forestry Service. It's its own kind of like little fiefdom.
You wrote an interesting thing, or you were featured recently on LitHub, where this show actually used to get distributed, about how to write a funny book about American immigration. Of course, it's a good question. I mean, it's such a frustrating, bureaucratic mess at the best of times.
Yes.
How do you write anything funny, Felipe, about it?
Well, I think the finding a format to be able to explore this chaotic system, it's so complicated. It's like a maze. So to me, having this kind of like interactive format allowed me to have some freedom to be like, okay, well, one of the things that they taught me in my comedy education when I was training at a theater here in New York, the Upright Citizens Brigade, is the premise of, if this is true, then what else is true? So if this absurd thing is reality, then how can you heighten that reality? And for me, the immigration system is so absurd. It's so Byzantine and chaotic that I was like, okay, well, I can heighten this to an extra level. And so when I keyed in on this format of like allowing the person who's reading it to be the many characters, to inhabit the immigrants, and also to be playing with the book, going to one page, making their own choices, it allowed me to change the tone immediately of the conversation. Because you say immigration and everyone's like, oh, it gets tense. But if you're saying like, no, this is a game, we're playing this game, it's about immigration, but it's a game, all of a sudden there's a levity to it. And then you take the real absurdities and the real chaos of the system and just heighten it, which is basically what you do with comedy at all times.
Who are the fathers or perhaps the mothers of this kind of comedy? The person who comes to my mind is Kafka, who found his own writing very funny. I'm not sure everyone necessarily agrees. He, of course, wrote extensively about Central Mid-European bureaucracy and its darkness and absurdity. Who's inspired you both as a comic writer and particularly in terms of this book?
Well, actually, Kafka also has a great book called America.
Yes, which a wonderful first paragraph about seeing the Statue of Liberty.
Yes, which is also kind of about this. But I would say my inspirations comedically are, I don't think I would have written this book without like the work of Tina Fey. I think Bossy Pants was a book where I was like, oh, you can be funny in writing. And Carrie Fisher is a big Star Wars nerd, two like great funny writers who were just like writing funny things about their lives. But I think the playfulness of it all, actually, I was inspired by this Argentine writer, Julio Cortázar, who wrote a novel that in English is translated as Hopscotch. And this novel is a huge like structural disruptor, in the like what we call the Latin American boom of writing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he wrote this novel that is like a game of hopscotch. You're jumping from chapter to chapter. He's directing you back and forth. So I read a lot of that. And I read that in my youth, and then I reread it as I was older. And then there are writers like George Saunders who can be very funny while talking about very sad or very poignant things. And so that was also a big inspiration to me. But, I am a late night writer. So I was interested in actually making it like haha funny, not just, sensible chuckle funny, kind of like a very like intellectual kind of funny. So I was also inspired by, my job and like Colbert's original character in Colbert's book, America, I Am American, So Can You, the writing of The Onion, and, the book, the Daily Show book, America, which is just kind of like an explanation of what the federal government is and what the country is, written in the tone of the correspondents or the writers for The Daily Show back in the original Jon Stewart iteration. So all those books kind of like informed me and made me like realize, oh, you can make like a humorous guide that's jokey and funny, but also is actually saying something, isn't just like, or teaching you something. Because the biggest reason I started writing this book is that Americans don't know their own immigration system, and they have so many opinions about immigration, particularly now, but no one knows what it entails, and I don't just mean like conservatives, you know. I don't just mean like, oh, MAGA people. Like, I was living in New York in the Obama years, or like the late Obama years, and none of my liberal Brooklyn, you know, IPA, iced matcha drinking friends had any idea what I was going through, you know, when I was trying to get my visas.
The liberals drink IPA. I didn't know that. I drink IPA. I may have to change my beer. It's interesting you bring up in the first part of that response the Argentine novelist. There's something so surreal now about America. There's an interesting piece in the Times about not being able to pin Trump down because he says one thing one day, the next thing the next day, and everyone accepts that these are contradictions. Now the Times describes these contradictions as this ultimate cover. I'm not quite sure why they're a cover if you say one thing one day and the next something the opposite the next day. But is there a Latin American quality to this? I mean, there's a whole tradition of Latin American writing observing the cruel absurdities of dictators and wannabe dictators.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of our literary tradition. You know, the dictator novel. You have Vargas Llosa's The Feast of the Goat. You have Garcia Marquez, my compatriot. You know, like the Colombian.
Who's one of my favorite, magnificent writers.
It's possibly. I hesitate to say my favorite writer because it creates a ranking, but
well, amongst your favorite,
amongst my favorite writers, 100 Years of Solitude, obviously. That is possibly my favorite novel. But he has also, I believe it's The Autumn of the Patriarch, which is his novel about dictators. Yeah, I mean, there is a, I wouldn't say it's a South American or Latin American quality to it. I think it's just once you encounter it, it is so absurd that art does have to come out and talk about it, you know? And, you know, you see in a book like The Autumn of the Patriarch, that is a character full of contradictions. That is a character who in chapter 1 hates a particular figure because they think that they're against him, and then becomes friends with them and then hires him to be his personal bodyguard. You know, that is what dictators are, and that is what authoritarians do. It is the cult of the person. It is the whims of the person and the opinion of the person are the be all and the end all, to the point where the nation is at the whims of a person, of those person's contradictions. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a Latin American nature to this, but I think Latin America, because we experience dictatorship in many times, supported or boosted by the United States, Latin Americans were able to find a way to turn this into art, and quite good art is what I would say.
Yeah, and of course, it's the artists who are best able to respond to this. As you know, it's not just a Latin American thing. The Central Europeans, the Czechs in particular.
Yes.
Milan Kundera has written a series of wonderful books about this. But the only way to respond to someone like Trump, for example, who says one thing one day, the next thing the next day, when he talks about tariffs, he says, well, I'm going to have 25%. And the next day, oh, I've decided I'm not going to have 25%. Then the following day, he's going to change his mind again. The policy people are not very helpful here. We need artists, satirists of one kind or another, humorists like yourself, to actually respond to this, don't we?
I think so. I think that is what helps you. I mean, it's the emperor has no clothes, right? That's how you talk, and it's about all kinds of government. Obviously, autocracy or dictatorship is one thing, but in all systems of government, these are powerful people who think they know better, and who think that they are invincible. And you know what satire or humor and art does is just point out and say, like, wait, that's weird. That thing they just did is weird. And being able to point that out is a talent, but also that's why people respond to it so well. People say, like, yeah, that is weird. I also noticed that. And so you create community, you create partnership in there. And so all of a sudden you're punching up, which is something you want to do in comedy. You want to make fun of the people who have more power. And you're all punching up and laughing at the same thing. And you're all kind of reminding each other, you're not crazy. This is weird.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that worries me, I was on the Colbert Show a few years ago in the original show. I mean, he's a brilliant comic, very funny. But him and Jon Stewart and the others, they've been going so long, and I'm not saying they haven't changed their shtick. I mean, writers like you produce very high quality work for them. But it's one of the problems that these guys have been going for a while, and America has changed, but perhaps they haven't.
I mean, it's an interesting thing to bring up, particularly with Steven, because his show was completely different 10 years ago. He was a completely different show. He was doing a character, right? And now he's doing a more traditional late night show. I think the format of late night is a very interesting beast that somehow has become a political genre. You know, it didn't used to be with Letterman, didn't used to be with Conan O'Brien, Jay Leno. You know, they would dabble in politics. They would talk about politics because it's what people are talking about. But now it's become kind of like this. Well, it all has to be satire, and there's some great work, and I do think people keep innovating and making like new things, even though the shows are about 10 years old. You know, you have Last Week Tonight, which my wife writes for, but it's a show that does more like deep dive investigations and stuff like that. So it's more like a end of the week 60 minutes, but with jokes kind of format. But I do think, yeah, maybe like the shows and the genre in general, like the genre could do with some change and some mixing it up. And
well, maybe your friend Kumar could
yeah, well
get a slot or his own late night show. And I wonder also, when it comes to, I don't want to obsess over Trump, although of course it's hard not to these days, but because he himself is a media star who most people know through his reality television appearance, and he still behaves like a reality television star. Mm-hmm. Does that add another dimension of challenges to satirical writers like yourself and comics like or satirical comics like Colbert and Jon Stewart?
I think it's just a layer of how to interpret him as a person. At least for me, it's like, okay, well, you have to remember that he is a showman, and that's what he's doing. You know?
So coming back to your metaphor of the emperor not having any clothes on, he kind of, in his own nod and wink way, acknowledges that he's not pretending to wear any clothes.
Yeah, and well, sometimes he is, and sometimes he isn't, and that's the challenge, and that's why writing jokes about him every day is hard. But you know, we
and the more I know, I watched Saturday Night Live last week, the Zelensky thing, and it was brilliant. Zelensky and Musk and Trump, but I'm very doubtful it actually impacts in any way on anything.
Well, and I think that's also a misconception people have about comedy. You know, comedy is there to be funny. You know, comedy isn't there to change your mind. If it does that, great. But the number one impetus for comedy should be to make you laugh. So the idea that like a sketch show is going to change the nation, I don't know. Those are things that I think are applied onto comedy. They're kind of globbed onto comedy. I don't necessarily think that that's what the people making the comedy set out to do. So I think if it made you laugh and if it works, the comedy has done its job. Comedy, unfortunately, can't change the world, you know. Otherwise, you know, I'm sure there would have been there are many good Romanian comedians who could have done something about Czech, you know,
from time to time. I mean, Havel became Czech president for a while. You know that you sometimes see laughter and comedy as a kind of therapy when it comes to some of the stuff you do with Colbert. Are you in America? Let me in. Are you presenting the experience, the heartbreaking experience, or certainly an enormously frustrating experience of the American immigration system as a kind of therapy, both for people who are experiencing it and outsiders, Americans in general?
And for myself, I think
And of course,
yes.
yourself, self
I
therapy, so to speak.
I think so. I mean, it is for me a way to like comedy is a way to process things for me. It comes naturally to me, and it is inopportune at times when dealing with things like grief and things like that. But I mean, if anyone who's gone through grief, I think can tell you there's one moment when things are going really bad, and one of the people grieving with you makes one joke, and you all laugh, and you're like, this somehow fixed for 1 second. It was great, and then we're back to sadness. So I think comedy, as much as, again, I go back to what I said a second ago, it's about making you laugh, and that making you laugh can create that partnership, can create that empathy, and that community therapizing, I guess, of people saying like, oh wait, yeah, this is weird, this is strange, and I feel better that someone else recognized it, that someone else saw this.
It certainly makes you saner. You wrote an interesting piece for the New Yorker this week in times
I
like
did.
these, where you write perhaps satirically about what you call good Americans. Is the book written for good or bad Americans, or all Americans, or no Americans? Who do you want to read this book?
Oh my God. I want everyone to read it and everyone to buy a copy so that I
Of
can make a
course,
lot
that
of
goes
money.
right.
No, I think it's written for most Americans and immigrants as well, people living here. But I do think, yeah, it's written for everyone. I don't think I wrote it with a particular like kind of group in mind. I think, to me, obviously, with my background and my political affiliations, I think liberals will enjoy the book. But I also think, people who are conservative, people who are MAGA, people who don't necessarily agree on my vision of immigration, um, can learn a lot from the book. And I purposely wrote it so that these people wouldn't necessarily be alienated or dismissed in any way. It's a huge topic, and I think it was more of a like, I know you have an opinion, I'm just showing you some evidence, make with it what you will, but I'm just showing you some evidence that it might not be as you believe it is, both for liberals and conservatives. Wherever you are on the spectrum, liberals think it's super easy, conservatives think it's super easy but in a bad way to move here, and I'm here kind of saying like, hey, it's actually this super complicated thing that maybe we should talk about, and we should try to reform in some way.
Yeah, and I think even when it comes to immigration, often people are talking about different things. Conservatives tend to be talking about quote unquote illegal immigration, and progressives are talking about something else. Do you deal with people who try to get into America illegally, or is that for you just a subject that you're not touching in this book?
I address it very lightly toward the final pages of the book. First of all, I can't like claim ownership on all immigrant narratives, and I wrote this about the legal immigration system because it's what I've navigated. Again, I am not an immigration lawyer, I am not an activist, I'm a comedy writer who happened to go through the immigration system. So but I did feel like, okay, well, let's talk for a second. You've seen how hard it is because I've shown you all this evidence in the first couple stories in the book. And again, I say in the last pages because of the interactive nature of the book, there is potentially a way for this to be one of the first things you read in the book. But toward the last pages of the book, I say, okay, let's talk about you. We've seen how hard it is. Let's talk about the people who do so much to try and come here, and who go even harder because they do it in the unauthorized way, or the people who come here seeking asylum, which is a legal way to come to the United States, but is very difficult. So I do present that, but I do think it is not necessarily the subject of a comedy book. As I said earlier, when you're dealing with comedy, you want to be punching up, you want to be making fun of people in authority figures or in a sort of status position that is above the general population or the voice of the comic. And with undocumented immigrants and people trying to come here in irregular ways, it's very hard to find the humor there because these people are already suffering very much. And so to me, the line is threading the line of comedy there. It can very quickly turn into bullying or making fun of those people. And I don't want to do that because a lot of people are already doing that. And a lot of people who are already doing that work on this in this administration. So I don't really want to mess with that.
Felipe, I'm not sure if you've got a Spanish translation of the book. I'm sure there will be one eventually.
Hopefully.
If people start reading this in Colombia, where you're from, Bolivia, or Argentina, Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, they think to themselves, this is so hard to get in, even legally, even if you have money to pay for lawyers. They might think, well, fuck it, I'll just try and get over the border illegally. Do you think in a way, I mean, it's obviously designed as a humor book, but in a way, this would encourage any sane person to actually give it up? I mean, try and go somewhere else, or just stay where you are.
I think the book has a tone of I'm a pretty optimistic person. So I think the book does have a tone of optimism and love for America. I do love the United States, where while presenting it as a difficult thing, I am also saying like it's pretty good. You're gonna have a good time if you make it here. So I don't think necessarily it'll be a deterrent. Whether it's some sort of Trojan horse to create more people to try and come through the border, I don't know. It'd be pretty funny if a funny book ended up doing that. But
it'd be great if the conservatives got hold of the book and blamed you for all the illegal immigrants. But in all seriousness, there's been a lot of pieces recently about, according to the New York Times, people going silent and fear of retribution. As a comic writer and someone clearly on the left, a progressive in American politics, do you think that there is a new culture of fear? Are some of your friends and colleagues in the comedy business, are they fearing retribution? Trump, of all people, doesn't like to be laughed at. Some people say that he only wanted to be president after Obama so brilliantly and comically destroyed him a few years ago.
I think in comedy, I think people are tired of talking of Trump because, again, as I said, 10 years of writing about him. I don't think anyone is necessarily afraid of talking about him or making fun of him. I think that is, or his administration. I think that is proven like this past week with the explosion of memes making fun of JD Vance's face, to the point where JD Vance has tried to hop on the meme and be like, haha, yes, I enjoy this very much too. Haha, yeah. Good job, memers. So like, obviously, first of all, he doesn't like it, but I think everyone is, and I think this is something that America does so well. Americans like to make fun of politicians, period. And even though I think in certain spaces of politics and activism, there might be fear of retribution that is much more marked. I think let's make fun of the emperor for having no clothes, let's make fun of them, is an instinct that it's not going away, and it won't go away anytime soon.
Felipe, finally, you've written a funny book about immigration, but of course, behind all the humor is a seriousness. Lots of jokes. It's a very entertaining, amusing, creative book, but it also, I think, suggests reform. You've given a great deal of thought. You've experienced it yourself. How can America improve its immigration story so that we don't have in the future more satirical books like America Let Me In? What are the reforms realistically that can be made that even conservatives might buy into?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that if you look at it historically, there hasn't been comprehensive immigration reform since Clinton, which is ridiculous. We're nearing on 30 years there, and we're basically 30 years since, and I'm 33, so it's a whole lifetime for a lot of people with no changes to a system, no comprehensive changes to a system, and that just means that like it is going to become outdated. So obviously it's very hard right now with the tenor, but what we really need is for people to sit down and talk about it as a normal issue. This is not an invasion. This is not a national emergency. It is simply an issue, an economic issue. And I think one of the biggest things, and one of my personal suggestions, is that the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service has always been, as I said, this kind of strange ancillary part of the government. It started as part of the Department of Labor, eventually joins the Department of Justice, then it goes back to Labor. It kind of always bounces around. They don't know where it fits. And after 9/11, it became part of the Department of Homeland Security. And I think that creates an aura around immigration as something that is threatening to Homeland Security, which is not true.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's become the sex when it comes to, in the context of Victorian, something that we don't talk about, and we use metaphors and similes to describe. And I take your point on that. But what about and I take your point on the fact that the system hasn't been reformed since Clinton. But let's end with a couple of final, just doable reforms, Felipe, that can actually make the experience better, that will improve, that might be cheaper, that the Doge people might buy into, that both left and right will accept and say, well, that's fair enough. This is one way we can make immigrating to America a better experience.
I think rewarding, if we're talking about this idea of like we want the best immigrants, educated people, I think actually rewarding that, because the current system does not do that. For most people trying to get a work visa, they're subjected to a lottery where the chances are something like 1 in 16 of getting a work visa to be here. And that is really bad for companies in general. It's something that the big tech firms have been lobbying against for years. And because there's no consensus in Congress to actually do something, we haven't been able to address that. So I think actually rewarding the kind of like higher education, high achievement immigrants in a way that isn't just like, if you have $5 million, you can buy a gold card.
Yeah, and that's what Trump had promised.
Right. Actually rewarding it in a way that's like, okay, well, if you have a college degree, maybe you don't just get a 1-year permit to work here. Maybe there is a path for you to, if you made your education here, if you start your professional life here, if you are contributing, because all these immigrants are paying taxes or contributing, maybe there's a path that isn't as full of trapdoors and pitfalls. I would say that's one of the biggest things. And honestly, higher up, like I do think maybe this is my progressive side of me, but it's like, get more people working in USCIS so that these waits aren't taking forever, and get more immigration judges, hire people who are going to make this system efficient, because that is, I think, unfortunately, what Doge thinks, that, we're going to slim it down so it doesn't cost that much. Yeah, but if you slim it down, you don't have enough people. And there's a lot of people who are still trying to come here and they're still trying to do things. And if you don't have enough people like working those cases, all you're creating is backlogs.
Yeah, I'm guessing when Doge transforms the American immigration system through AI, you'll have another opportunity, Felipe, to write a book. America Let Me In, an important book, a very funny book, but also a very serious book by one of America's leading young comic writers, full-timer, writing for Stephen Colbert, Felipe Torres Medina. Felipe, congratulations on the book. It's out next week. I think it will become a bestseller. Important book, very funny too. And we can say the same about you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. expert.